All right, Chuck, we are live. Good afternoon to our friends here on the East Coast, and good morning to the rest of the country. We appreciate you being with us. I'm here with my associate, Chuck Peralt. Chuck is the Vice President of Advanced Planning at Prudential, one of the brilliant young minds in our industry. Chuck, welcome.
I don't know if I'm happier to be called brilliant or young, but thanks for having me.
Well, you're both, my friend. So this is a web version of a live event that Chuck and I hosted at the Jersey Shore in Stone Harbor, New Jersey, a couple weeks ago. It's a little more tight. It's a little more condensed, just so we can wrap this up before the top of the hour. But the messaging is the same. And what I'd like to do is just start to share my screen here and take you through what we've put together. This is all new and exciting information. Chuck and I are going to tag team these concepts. So we call this Wealth on the Water or Beyond the Exemption because we hosted this at the Jersey Shore, and we'll be doing another event next week in the Hamptons. Today is obviously the digital version. And the messaging is that the large case, right, for clients 15 million and up is not dead, right? The sunset is gone, but the opportunity isn't. So we wanted to really focus on giving you the tools to continue to work with clients of that wealth. Um, just because they're under the exemption today doesn't mean they're going to be there forever. And we're going to give you some math and some calculators and some tools that will prove that out. So just setting the stage. Red Adair said, right, if you think it's expensive to hire a professional, wait till you hire an amateur, right? So you really want to work with folks that know what they're doing. Um, I always like to start with how the U.S. gift and estate tax system works. Um, Chuck, we all get an annual gift exclusion of 19,000 per year in 2026. We all get a unified credit. This is the big number in the political football. Through the one big beautiful bill, this is now 15 million per individual. That is the probably the most effective tool to combat the U.S. gift and estate tax system. We're all in a 40% rate, right? Any assets transferred above the exemption are taxed at a flat 40% rate, during life or at death. We all have portability, right? Surviving spouse can elect to use their deceased spouse's unused exemption, doubling the effect, right? So a married couple goes from 15 to 30 million. We still have some state estate taxes to contend with. There's 18 states and jurisdictions that impose their own. New York is a big one. So you want to be mindful there. And then there's an IRD problem where you get certain assets, retirement accounts namely, are passing through the system with a double taxation, estate tax at death and then every qualified dollar um, that the beneficiary draws down is subjected to income. So, right, there are a lot of tools to use to combat the U.S. gift and estate tax issues. And, the planning conversation really shifted from 15 million, the lack of the sunset, 30 million for married couples. So, the permanent exemption removed the deadline of the sunset, but it didn't remove the problem. And Chuck, I want to set the stage here, and this I'm happy to share the deck. What's really interesting about this piece is that we started to look at how quickly assets are growing in comparison to the exemption. And we found that there is a massive gap between the growth rate or the compound annual growth rate between virtually every asset class and the exemption. And although we look at 15 million as an unprecedented exemption amount, at least we have some permanency and we can do some long-term planning. But if you look at Trump's first term, when the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act passed, it went effective January 1st, 2018, through the end of the second quarter this year, the exemption is only growing at 3.5%. Meanwhile, every asset class is growing outside of personal residence is growing, and depends on where you are in your personal residence and what part of the country, is growing at double digits. Bitcoin, since that same measurement period, has grown by 19.5%. The S&P's at 14.5, spot gold's 14. Closely held businesses between 10 and 100 million that exited are at 11.8. So assets are growing faster than the exemption. So what our calculator will demonstrate is that if you plan to live another two, three, or four, maybe even 5 decades, you will have a transfer tax exposure by life expectancy, because the magic of compounding growth, particularly that's outpacing the compound annual growth rate of the exemption, becomes staggering. And what we're suggesting is to begin to gather assets, right? Begin to start asking questions about assets, liabilities, net worth, put some growth rate assumptions onto those assets and to that balance sheet or that statement of net worth, and allow us to help you project out the potential liability in future years, assuming these compound annual growth rates continue, right? And I always ask, advisors, like, have you talked to your client? Like, what was the net worth of your client 10 years ago compared to today? And it's usually a pretty dramatic answer, right? And then you fast forward not 10 more, but 20 or 30 more years at that same pace. And there's planning to do, right? So um, you look at, even at a modest 5% growth rate, a $30 million estate today is worth 54 million in 10 years, 96 million in 20 years, 172 million in 30 years. And of that 172 million, the IRS is going to take 70 million of that 172 million. So, our messaging here is to identify the need, right? And then start to shift into solutions. We never want to lead with solutions. We want to demonstrate to clients the math, have them understand like where they want their assets to go, to whom, when, what does it look like, and is there any liability that could potentially creep into the picture in the future. So, we built this calculator. It's really for any client. $15 million net worth at 5%, right? At 15 million at 5% by age 92 reaches 116 million. So there's a $12 million federal estate tax due at 5%. Some clients, Chuck, they you toss out numbers like 5% and they laugh at you, right? So okay, how about at 10? Well, look at again the magic of compounding interest. Like 10% grows to 821 million and 295 million in federal estate tax. Like the magic of compound interest over 4 decades is really powerful, really powerful.
And I
Um,
think the thing I like
yeah,
most about your piece too, right? You could show the compound return of all the different assets. And it's easy to say we've been in a heck of a market, right? But I think maybe the thing that stood out to be more, and as much hearing you talk about this the second time as the first, the estate tax exemption feels like it's gone up so much, right? And it's like a 3.5% average growth. And when you put it in that perspective, no one thinks their assets are going to grow that slowly, right? Like 3.5%, we'd all think would be sort of almost the worst case. So, it really draws a starkness to the reality of like, it feels like it's going up by a lot. It's not.
it's not. And then, just Just go to the local grocery store, Chuck, and look at the inflationary rate on, beef and eggs and chicken, and it's a different world that we're living in. Now you throw in the state, right, potential again, and get back to that 18 jurisdiction issue where here's New York, same $15 million couple that moved to New York to be closer to their grandkids face a 16% state estate tax on the full estate once they cross the $7.1 million cliff. So, 50, I mean, it's pretty massive, right? So that also needs to be built into our calculator. Um, how our calculator works is pretty easy, right? Give us your client age, state of domicile, current net worth. Let's peg some growth rate assumptions to it. Identify of the net worth, how much of those assets are qualified retirement plans, and then we'll kick you the output, and we'll automatically apply 2058 estate tax deductions and 691 for qualified assets. We'll take you through New Jersey exemptions, New Jersey repeal, Massachusetts cliff, and all other state specific rules. So it really opens up opportunity. So, once we quantify the need, um, and you identify where assets sit, now we can start shifting the conversation into so many different other directions. So, Chuck, what we're going to get into is, uh, what are wealthy clients doing? What are high net worth families doing when they work with estate attorneys, CPAs, and family offices, right? What are being introduced? So we're going to cover, buying life insurance to solve current and future issues, reviewing not only personal but trust assets, identifying any trust-owned life insurance opportunities. Look at spousal lifetime access planning tools. Look at private placement, right? When you have assets and liabilities, you get a very clear picture of where assets sit. Are they in private equity? Are they in real estate? Are they in private credit? Should private placement be at least introduced to the planning discussion? Look at transferring risk based on future potential care planning. Um, Charitable endeavors, right? Does clients have charitable needs and also need to mitigate income taxes? So the advisors, having these conversations are retaining AUM, they have their clients' attention, they're earning advanced markets compensation and they're becoming really valuable to their clients. Um, so, there's really the roadmap is fairly simple, right? You can do nothing. You could draft your basic documents. You can start looking at beneficiary trusts. But if you really want to move the needle, you start to look at ILETs and slats and introduce some advanced strategies, which in the next 30 minutes or so, we're going to focus on the right side of this roadmap. So one thing that's getting a ton of buzz today, and it's easily identifiable as an opportunity, particularly if you're gathering assets and liabilities, is when to start talking about private placement life insurance and the opportunities associated with private placement life insurance, not just to help your client with their alternatives in private equity and private credit assets and mitigate income tax, but where's the second bite at the apple? And Chuck is a true expert in this field, and I'm going to turn this over to him for the next few minutes to talk about the dual sale and how the buzzwords of private placement can translate into traditional life insurance sales while helping the client. So, Chuck, what's the
Yeah, but
hardest part about the life insurance business?
I think the hardest part, and I think we can all appreciate this, is finding new people to talk to, right? Like there's not exactly a line out the door of people banging down our door saying, let's buy life insurance. And in fact, a couple times in our life where people proactively reach out to us wanting to buy life insurance, our first reaction is almost like, all right, what did the doctor tell you that you are now ready to buy life insurance, right? And this is, I literally just did this. I have my physical next week. I just bought more life insurance because we all know, like nothing helpful to the life insurance process comes out of a potential visit to a doctor, right? So, private placement, though, on the other hand, is turning this on its head a little bit because pretty consistently we are seeing private placement life insurance come up in a Barron's article, right? In a Wall Street Journal article, and saying things like, the way ultra rich people are avoiding taxes and that stuff gets read by our clients. That stuff is at least going to prompt them to start asking questions about it and whether or not it's for them. But what we found is that most advisors don't really understand it or really even know that much about it. And I think you'll see a number as we go through this about how many advisors are actually selling this, and you'll understand why. In the financial planning world, right, life insurance is very often outside of it, especially traditional life insurance, right? The annuities have kind of found a home, right? If you go into a large asset manager or a large wirehouse, annuities are probably being regularly incorporated by at least a decent portion of the advisors there. But the life insurance has always kind of sat outside of it in a lot of ways that I'm sure you all can appreciate. They often don't even want to bring it up. They don't want to have to ask medical questions, things like that. And life insurance, and I'm going to argue here, especially private placement life insurance, should really be part of that plan, right? If by treating it as a separate silo, we're really not doing justice to anything else in the plan and kind of ignoring what could be a really key component to it. Part of the reason that we're seeing this growth in the private placement business, and if you're not familiar with some of the numbers industry wide, at Prudential, it was something like a quarter of our sales last year, right? We're the biggest life insurance company in the US, I think in the world, and it's a quarter of our sales. And a couple of years ago, when I started, it was meaningful, but nothing like that. It's because a lot of clients are stepping outside of the traditional investments. I've been doing this about 20 years. I imagine there's a lot of experience in the folks listening to this. And it was always 60-40 or 70-30 or the percent bonds you should have should match your age, right? These are all things we used to hear. What we're seeing happen with more and more sophisticated asset managers is it's not really 60-40. It maybe is something like 50-30-20, with the 20 being some kind of alternative investment, right? Something like private equity, private credit is a real big one. For more affluent clients, it can be hedge funds. So as people are sort of shifting their asset allocation more and more away from the things a traditional VUL might invest in, where a traditional VUL largely is going to have a fairly straightforward portfolio of stock and bond funds. Private placement, it has really come into play to fill the need for the people who are investing more and more outside of the less traditional asset allocations.
Thanks, Chuck. What are the key differences between traditional VUL and private placement VUL? Because they're just the same exact chassis on a variable universal life. What else is different?
Yeah, I wouldn't think of them as different, really. Private placement life insurance follows all the same rules as traditional life insurance, right? We still have guideline and CVAT, right? We still have to follow all the IRS tax codes you guys have ever heard. From the death benefits still income tax free, right? Like everything you know about life insurance and how it works applies the same to private placement as it does to traditional policies. The difference is where the money goes. When you look at a VUL, and you'll see an example on here of ours, but I would argue this applies pretty much across the industry. The type of funds you see in a VUL are the Fidelities, the American funds, the Franklin funds, right? And this is probably a lot like what many of your clients have in their investment accounts and definitely in things like their employer 401k. Private placement has those options. They're not really utilized, but they do exist inside of private placement. But really, where the assets get allocated is less traditional places. It gets allocated to private vehicles like some of the larger Blackstone funds, the Apollo funds, the Millennium funds. Golub Capital is one that I wasn't familiar with before I've spent much time in this world, and I imagine it would be true across all of you all as well, where a lot of assets are going inside of private placement. So maybe you've heard of some of these. I imagine some of you have at least heard of some of those names. Maybe you haven't, but amongst our higher net worth clients, these are a lot of the big names. And that's really the only difference between these is what you are investing in. In that traditional VUL, it's the registered mutual fund like sub accounts, right? The American funds inside of our traditional VUL have a corresponding American fund mutual fund that you can invest in outside of that product and buy exactly the same thing, right? Literally the same exact thing inside of it. Private placement VUL works really similar, but instead of the funds inside of it matching a mutual fund, the funds inside of it match a hedge fund, or they match, or they might be a managed separate account, an MSA, SMA, depending on what company you're dealing with, where they are mimicking funds an RIA might manage for their clients on behalf of their clients. So, in a lot of ways, it's the exact same thing. They're just like American Funds creates just a different version of their product that goes in an insurance policy and calls it something a little bit different, but is effectively the same thing. These hedge funds, these RIAs, are very much doing exactly the same thing with the assets that they manage, and it's just ending up inside a private placement VUL. So that is the difference, right? There's no difference in tax rules. The difference lies entirely in what the clients have already largely chosen to invest their money in. We're not trying to convince them that investing in these things is a good idea, right? They are already doing it. We're simply showing them how to do it inside of a life insurance contract and therefore take advantage of some of the tax benefits that we're all familiar with.
And it goes back to that detailed fact find, Chuck. If you have a balance sheet, if you have a statement of financial position, you will see where the assets sit. You will see if they are sitting at Apollo or Blackstone, and it's an easier identifiable opportunity to have that discussion with your client. Um, Chuck, I know is pertaining to Prudential, right? Who's selling these deals? Because everybody seems to be talking about them, right? And so many advisors come to me with a high net worth client. They're like, I'm thinking about private placement. Um, but are they really thinking about private placement? Do they really understand private placement? Like, who, how many policies are being sold and how many producers are selling with Prudential?
A lot more than there used to be, but as a just pure size of the number, not very many, right? You can see on the screen the numbers in the past 4 or 5 years have
Hmm.
roughly tripled, both in the number of producers that we see selling this and the number of policies that we're placing at Prudential. But it tripled from 24. It's up to 77. That's slightly more than one person per state in the country, right? I mean, it's really just not that many people. Now, granted, some of those 77 people are people who specialize in this. There's a whole team behind them. It probably doesn't feel like one person, and that maybe is part of the point. But while this is a growing market and we're seeing more and more people enter this space, right? We're seeing more and more wirehouses build programs
Yeah.
around this. We're seeing more and more RIAs encouraging their clients to look at this and consider this as part of their offerings. Just nominally, it's not very many people, right? So while it has grown really dramatically, There's still a lot of lack of understanding, and frankly, just a lot of people not even knowing that they can do it or should do it or can talk about it within their firms. And what we're, I think, going to continue to see over the next couple of years is this number continue to grow at a pretty big rate, right? More and more of the firms that we work in at Pru are building programs and sort of coming online for the advisors that they work with to be able to look at this product. But there's a huge amount of opportunity because, again, despite the growth, it's almost nobody that's out there selling this at this point.
Yeah. And as assets continue to grow and the allocation continues to evolve to hold certain percentage of assets in private, um, it's no longer a niche institutional strategy. It's moving into the independent advisor channel. So the advisors in this room or on this webinar who learn it now have a first mover advantage, right? And I think what we want to showcase here, Chuck, is how to complement and not compete with it, right? I would sometimes try and move clients off of private placement and into traditional if I didn't really think they understood their goals and objectives. But it doesn't have to be one or the other. If they do have an allocation into private, right, then why not utilize the PPVUL chassis? Um, Continue to fact find, continue to give them what they want, utilize our calculators, and then quantify as a second bite of the apple the traditional life insurance needs. So, Chuck, I need you and Prudential have done an amazing job. Why don't you give us some color around this and lead us into this dual sale opportunity?
Yeah, so look, if we just take a step back from the private placement, right? Prudential, aside from private placement, has three traditional sort of shelf product VULs, right? Well, why on earth would we need three VULs? It's because they don't all do the same thing, right? If you wanted a contract that builds cash the best, that's one of our products. If you want a contract that has lifetime guarantees, that's a different product. Right. Well, this is true when you think about private placement. Private placement is designed for those cash accumulation sales, right? For the clients that are looking to accumulate cash and get the tax advantage, the question is just, are they investing in sort of the traditional American fund and fidelity type thing, or are they investing in the type of assets that are only in private placement? That will determine which product they should buy. It's not more difficult than that. That being said, if you're looking for something like estate tax planning, right? If you're trying to do guaranteed death benefits, private placement doesn't do it. It's a cash accumulation maximizing vehicle. So for a more estate planning and death benefit oriented sale, you would still use all of the products that you might be more familiar with talking about it. Here's why they complement each other, though. For any client who's eligible for private placement, almost certainly has an estate tax problem, right? The minimum private placement premium that we will consider is $1 million, and most of the cases that we're seeing are well in excess of that because inside of that million, inside of the investments in PPVUL, there can be even higher minimums to access some of those investments. So because all of the clients that we're dealing with likely have or are going to have an estate tax problem as well, the private placement product can solve one need and an important need and help them with their income tax planning. For their estate tax and death benefit planning concerns, though, that traditional life insurance is going to have a place, I would say, really for every single client who's going to buy that private placement contract. So even if you live in the world of traditional life insurance and you don't know anything about PPVUL, understanding it was really important because for your highest net worth clients, they're already interested in talking about it. And I would argue it's the best door opener you could possibly have to doing the business that you're most familiar with doing with those high net worth clients.
Well said.
The PPVUL simple sale is relatively straightforward, right? None of this is easy, but the value proposition here is not hard to understand. If you are investing in a taxable account. And especially if you're investing in things like an SMA at a RIA or a hedge fund, there's often a lot of turnover in those accounts, and your return is going to get depleted by taxes. Additionally, some of the returns that you're going to see on those types of assets are taxed as ordinary income, not as capital gains. So what you see is a relatively high tax rate on the monies that people are investing in their taxable account. If you do that same investment inside of a private placement contract, you're only paying the policy costs. We've long made this conversation and sale a case with traditional investments, right? Buy your American funds inside of a traditional VUL. It's more tax efficient. That's going to outweigh the policy costs. It's just even more true inside of PPVUL because the nature of the assets that a client's investing in is that they're even less tax favored than the things that somebody might have traditionally invested in.
Well said.
So this is a case we did earlier in the year. This person was brought to us, brought to the advisor because they were investing in alternatives, right? It's somebody age 50 worth $50 million. They were already investing in alternatives, and they came to the conversation interested in talking about private placement, and they did do that, right? For this particular person, they moved four payments of a 1.25 million or $5 million inside of that private placement contract, and that's their sort of long-term tax deferred cash growth bucket. At the same time, a 50-year-old worth $50 million is going to have a federal estate tax problem in all likelihood. So while they were an underwriting, they just did a little bit more underwriting and bought a $15 million fully guaranteed death benefit. Instead of max funding it and getting $5 million in as quickly as possible, they spread it out over a longer period of time. And frankly, they spent much less money to get that death benefit. It's a different sale. But the combination of all of this is they got all the money that they wanted to inside of the private placement contract. They were able to guarantee that death benefit, to guarantee that estate liquidity from day one. And they simply were able to allocate the money appropriately. The cash growth was over here, and over here was the guaranteed death benefit, right? We don't want to use one product to do every possible thing if it's not good at it. We simply reposition and go to that dual sale where we can do a little bit of everything and maximize all of the monies in each individual bucket.
And solved a massive transfer tax exposure in year 30.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
And frankly, she's probably going to have a bigger one, right? If you're 50
Yeah.
worth 50 million,
Yeah.
you're
For
likely
sure.
going to have a larger than $50 million estate tax.
Yeah.
And
But
this
Chuck,
is the crux. Yeah.
yeah, very little difference, right, between cash value, right? The products behave so similarly at a 6.42 net ROR. It just goes back to your story about just different sub-accounts, right? What is your flavor of choice?
Yeah, if you run these contracts the exact same way, I would argue you guys are good salespeople. You could sell whichever one of these you want,
Hmm.
right? There's pros and cons to both products, but in the end, they're in the same ballpark, right? The difference is just that the client's going to invest in different things in one than the other. That's it. It's not harder than that.
Hmm.
I mean, there's some other moving parts in these, right? I'm not trying to overly simplify it, but not many. It really is one difference. What are they investing in?
You know, clearly, right? Clearly. So, the data, right, on the dual sale, again, it comes back to the financial fact finding. You're gathering the assets that you can then identify on how to reposition. If you see that they're sitting in Vanguard S&P, you may want to reallocate into a traditional VUL. If you see that they're sitting in Apollo or Blackstone, you may want to reallocate into PPVUL. But what it comes down to is, can you identify where the assets are, quantify a problem, and then provide a solution? As Chuck said, the medical underwriting is identical, right? You could even start to talk about, once you have a client in underwriting and you have access to all of their data, you can go a lot of different directions, right? There's like from one engagement, you could have six downstream conversations. The data is the engine. You can talk about so many things. So Chuck, that was a great segment. Um, the other area that we've been looking at is trust-owned policies and possibly even coupling trust-owned ownership with private placement VUL. And this is a pretty interesting strategy, right? There, I would say the slat, and I'm happy to send out an article that I was just exposed to recently. So that like the typical slat, like eyelid slat was funded with life insurance like a long time ago and not reviewed often enough. Um and Chuck, it from a carrier perspective, right? Who do you typically see as the trustee to an eyelid or a slat?
One of the biggest reasons people do it is because the spouse can be the trustee,
Right.
and it gives them that sort of extra feeling of control.
Yeah. But that's not always the most sophisticated trustee, right? And that's how small problems compound into major ones, right? Whether it be underfunding or lapse risk or structural misalignment or fiduciary exposure. So I think the advisor who initiates the trust-owned life insurance review becomes the trustee's most important resource because they typically aren't experienced and they gain direct access to the client relationship, even guaranteed products, right? Like we're looking at guaranteed VULs that had some timing of issues on 1035 exchanges that we had to fix. Or some have performed so well that they're allowed to take a distribution and not jeopardize the guarantee. So even if you think it's a set it and forget it strategy, it's usually not, right? And the fact that this spouse or adult child or family friend or brother with no insurance expertise or fiduciary training can lean on you or the advisors on this call, you become a really important resource. Um, just two things that I'll bring to your attention. The Uniform Prudent Investor Act that requires a trustee to be proactive and take a disciplined approach. You can't um, you can't just kind of wing it, right? You need to seek guidance from qualified professionals, document your actions. Like insurance is not a silo. Um, that insurance is included. The Cochrane standard. This one is a little scary. It's a case what happened when a trustee failed to actively manage trust-owned life insurance. They actually faced personal liability for a breach of fiduciary. Not the insurance company, not the advisor, the trustee. So, they never sought professional guidance. So, here we are waiting in the wings. Um, most non-professional trustees have never heard of this case. So that's exactly your opening, right? You want to lend a helping hand. Again, access to data and in-force policy information is really good data. There's so many things to manage when it comes to trust. You have oversight risk, you have inaction risk, structural risk, decision risk. But one thing that really jumps out at us, particularly since the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, is basis awareness. And Chuck, I go back to my opener and how quickly asset classes are growing. Well, that includes assets that were gifted to trust as well. So, you look at this back in 2018, a $25 million gift on a 60-year-old using a 10% asset growth value, there is a huge embedded taxable gain when you liquidate the sale of whatever asset you're investing in. Trusts do not get step up in basis like we do personally. So I think a lot of advisors and again, inexperienced trustees are taking their eye off the ball and not really considering what is the trust basis, right? And I don't even think certain tax professionals are aware or looking at this on an annual basis, right? How many of us go to our CPA 5 days before the filing deadline and say, save me as much money as possible? No one, they're not looking forward, they're looking backwards, right? It's when it's finished, when the year's already finished. So, the really good advisor is bringing this to the center of influence, the family office, the CPA, the trust and estate attorney, and the trustee, and saying, hey, just how we did an analysis on your assets and liabilities personally, I think we should do the same for your trust. And I think we should also consider what basis is in each of the assets for this particular reason. So, again, the compounding story is a powerful one, right? A really powerful one. So, again, here you are starting to identify issues that are beyond the exemption. It's way beyond, oh, I don't have a state tax problem, or I do have all my money is in trust, all right? You're getting into planning mechanics using the data. The data is the engine. Um, Chuck, Prudential has done a really nice job in combating a couple things here. One is the ability to make gifts without losing access to the asset themselves, right? The two is that trust basis issue that I just described wouldn't be an issue if you used a tax deferred or tax deficient asset inside the trust. Um, we talk a little bit about not just the slat, but a split dollar slat, which is another a little additional twist that Prudential's done a nice job illustrating and teaching.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if we're talking about clients who are doing estate planning, one of the biggest objections is the what if I need the money, right? Well, whether they say it or not, they're always worried about giving money away because no matter how rich they are, they think they might run out of it, right? And the slat is sort of a pretty common way that people have started to address this, right? Which is by giving one spouse access to the fund. So that's great, right? We can give away money to our trust. We can give our spouse access to the trust. Heck, maybe our spouse is even the trustee to make us feel like we have a little bit more control. All of that is great. But one of the objections that somebody might have even to that is, hey, it's great that I have access while I have a spouse. What happens if I don't have a spouse anymore for any number of reasons, right? And then all of a sudden the assets in there might be dealing with an even higher tax rate, right? We might be having assets that could have been in our estate and could have had a step up in basis, right? So we have to be prepared with how to overcome all of these objections. And I think simply by pairing something like private split dollar with the slat, you can get the client that much closer to an area of feeling like they have as much control as we can reasonably get them to. So the way that the way that that would be structured is by using a loan-based private split dollar arrangement, right? We're making loans to our trust. Importantly, it's loans and not gifts. So at any point in time, but we can do this for our clients because it's not reliant on having any kind of estate tax exemption. The loans fund a life insurance policy. The policy has all kinds of value in it, right? Which our spouse could have access to while they were alive. So while they're alive, they have access to that asset. That's great, solves the initial problem. If we're in a situation where that spouse who had access then died, you're in a situation where perhaps they could use some of the funds inside of the life insurance contract to repay the loans that were issued as part of the split dollar arrangement to get the money in the trust, right? So the beauty of this type of a design is that it's very flexible. We don't know what's going to happen. We don't know who's going to die when, no matter how much we might hope and think that we do. So by building in a strategy like this that gives them optionality, we can solve their estate plan goals, which is usually the first obstacle. And then at every stage, give them at least some way to access some of the funds in there and make them feel like they have a way back out of this if they need it. Even if it's a little bit different how they do it at each step of the way, there is always a way.
Yeah, well said. Well said. And the private split dollar being a little twist here, right? Very clever. Very clever. Um, There's an example of a married couple, 58, 55, 40 mil net worth. The existing slat was funded with whole life 12 years ago. It's got a nice amount of cash. Policy really wasn't reviewed. And they did have an allocation into private equity. So was it appropriate to introduce a portion of PPVUL while we continue to um, manage the whole life retained as the guaranteed floor? So you have this hedging, right, concept of a more balanced portfolio. Just personal preference, right? The slat exists, the policy's old, the trustee's a family member, and the trust review opens the split dollar slat conversation naturally. So there's a lot of different ways you can spin it. Um, Another thing high net worth clients are doing is using other people's money to address asset-based long-term care. Warren Buffett always says rule number one is never lose money. Then rule number two is never forget rule number one. Um, I think a lot of high net worth clients have dismissed long-term care planning because they could afford to pay for their own care. Um, but this isn't really an insurance conversation. It's where is your capital most efficient? And, if you are self-funding and subjecting yourself to market volatility risk, right? We teach a lot of sequence of return um, concepts where forced liquidation during a down market really impact the portfolio. You start to create some IRR inefficiencies, right? Self-pay returns exactly dollar for dollar, right? You spend a dollar and a dollar is spent, right? There's no leverage, there's no efficiency. So we've been looking at repositioning dead assets or quiet assets or unfriendly assets, right? Non-qualified annuities or CDs or savings or any type of fixed income. We're 1035ing from non-qualified to asset-based long-term care. Or even just a simple single premium reposition gets you some pretty significant leverage. And even if you live out to life expectancy or beyond, you have to look at the outcome, and that outcome is that you can be more aggressive in your portfolio because you don't have to solve for this potential self-pay. So coupling that with an AI strategy that we've been using called Water Lily, you give a client a 3-minute survey, regardless of their net worth. I think what we're pretty good at doing, or what this AI solution is pretty good at doing, is showing ROI on dollars out versus dollars spent per claim. So it just makes a whole bunch of sense. Working this strategy with family offices, many of them will look to their assets as a pool with potential future liabilities on the older population. So this becomes a really attractive transfer tool that could benefit the high net worth and not get caught up in this self-pay or I can handle this on my own. Um, and then lastly, I'll just walk you through this fairly quickly. If you have like ultra high net worth clients have a large bubble of income that are charitably inclined and need to do some estate planning, the lifetime grantor clat is an interesting technique. I won't get too far into the weeds. We have professionals that we would recommend you speak to about this if the opportunity exists. Um, but a CLAD is an irrevocable trust that pays in a fixed annuity to a charity on an annual basis. We're structuring this as a lifetime. So for the lifetime of the grantor, they're paying an income. The trust pays an income to the charity, and then it passes the remaining assets um, to the charity. There's a big back end obligation, and then anything left over goes to the family, income and estate tax free. So this again, like, requires a large income position, ultra high net worth, charitably inclined, wants to do some estate planning. Conceptually, this 57-year-old female would take a $5 million, purchase three contracts, a SPIA to fulfill the annual interest payment to the charity, a single pay UL, which fulfills the back end obligation to the charity, and then anything left over, they can then acquire additional single pay life insurance for the benefit of their family. So you're really fulfilling several buckets and several needs here, that create a pretty cool outcome with three contractually guaranteed contracts. And checking the charitable box, the income planning box, and the estate planning box. Really cool stuff, and I'm happy to share some additional information on this or make an introduction to the professionals who help us manage this strategy. Um, so, Chuck, I would say that in closing, right, the next steps is again to fact find. If you don't have a fact pattern, we'll send you a fact finder. We will help you with the calculators. You will not leave it to theory. You will see it. We can model this in your brand and your output. And once we have the data, we can then take this into several downstream conversations, the exemption gap, trust capital gains, long-term care, private placement, cash value leveraging models, charitable planning, IRA spend down. I mean, we can go in a lot of different directions, but we need the data. Like we can help you open conversations with the data. The partnership's pretty simple. I mean, we run the full analysis. We'll position it in your brand. The digital fact finder takes about 10 minutes to complete. You do not need to be an expert in everything covered today. We have professionals on our team like Chuck, and like his team at Prudential, and you submit your first case through Life Brokerage, and we're off and running. So I would say that if you can think of one name from today's call who has a net worth of $10 million, hasn't really done a lot of analysis, might have a slat or an islet with a policy, has a non-qualified annuity or low yielding asset sitting idle, just sold a business, is invested in private equity, right? These are the clients you are looking for. So complete that digital fact finder and we'll build the case right alongside you in a couple days. Um, I'd like to thank everyone as we approach the top of the hour here for your attention, for being with us. I want to thank my friend Chuck, for co-presenting. Chuck, I appreciate you. Another amazing job, well done. Anything to say? Any closing thoughts from your end?
Mm. I appreciate you putting this together and having us on here. Thank you.
All right. Thanks everyone. We appreciate you being with us. We'll send out a copy of the slides and a couple of the white papers that I promised. And we'll call this meeting adjourned at this moment. So be well. And again, thank you for being with us.
Thanks, guys.